Hello and welcome to the New Space Vision podcast, sponsored by LiveEO, where we discuss new space technology, finance, and innovation with the executives, founders, and more exciting people from the startup and new space ecosystem. I'm Daniel Seide.
And I'm Sven Shivara, and together we are the founders of the Earth observation company LiveEO and New Space Vision. We are here with Aakash, Chief Commercial Officer of Pixxel Space, on the podcast. Pixxel is launching a constellation of hyperspectral satellites and is building its own data analytics platform. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Big fan of your work, and it's always nice to talk to actual practitioners that are from the industry itself. So really good to be here.
Yeah, directly diving into the industry. So you have a background in business administration and marketing. How have you ended up in the space or Earth observation space?
Yeah, I ask myself that question all the time, and it's especially surprising because most people in the industry that I've had a chance to interact with over the last 3 years, they have a science or engineering background coupled with a very pure childhood fascination with space. And I went to business school, and it was obviously a very different community that I was exposed to then. Most people wanted to go into consulting or finance or venture capital. And the only thing that I knew then was that I wanted to work for a small business. It didn't even have to be tech, right? I just wanted to have direct access to the founders and have a relatively greater impact in the growth story. So I started the discovery process in college, and I studied business in Singapore and Sydney. And luckily, the visa regulations allowed for part-time internships in private companies. So I worked for a food distribution small business. I did something with Forbes magazine. I did an internship with a construction and engineering services firm, and one with a boutique consultancy. Unfortunately, they all converted into full-time offers, so I was even more confused. So I ended up just picking the founder that I liked the most. It was this guy, Zach Wilson, who had followed a semiconductor client to Singapore and was building out their clean room, and ended up just building a business sort of around that expertise. And when I joined him full-time, the company was less than 20 people, and they were all highly specialized engineers. So I was immediately thrown into the deep end of looking at mechanical and electrical diagrams and managing clients who wanted these high-tech build-outs like clean rooms and data centers. And at that time, the company was morphing from a traditional construction business to a frontier tech company because it had added this Internet of Things sensor portfolio to its services that could analyze occupancy patterns and deliver these occupancy analytics in commercial real estate. So really going into the smart building world. And I think from there on, simplifying complex subjects and using really basic relatable analogies is what I had to do to teach myself it. And then I realized that our customers had to be explained it in almost the same way. And then from there, I went to work at an ag tech company, and it was this company called Cropin that was building a pretty powerful full stack ag tech solution. And one of the provisions there was remote sensing based analytics. And I remember there was this project that we had acquired with Heineken. It was an innovation project with the beer company where they wanted to predict the yield of sorghum and barley in their farms in northern Nigeria. And we had used data from space. And that's really when I fell into this world. And I got pretty obsessed with it. I really wanted to execute the project, not just hand it over after closing it. So the project lead at that time took me under her wing, and she taught me the remote sensing concepts and the statistical analysis around it. And when we were solving for this project, we realized how challenging it was and how limited multispectral sensors were, right? The level of granularity, the specificity, the resolution was simply not available to be able to derive the right insights at the right time that was required. So she then went on to Pixxel to lead innovation and recommended me to the founders. And when I realized that this was a company that was building a 5-meter hyperspectral constellation with a daily revisit, it felt like the solution to the problem that I was facing with Heineken. And as a result, it was just directly inspired from a customer pain point, right? So that's when my science fiction associations with the space really converted into business value. And that's when I jumped at the chance.
Yeah, that's super exciting. We are always curious, how different selling in our industry is versus others. But I mean, you're sold in smart buildings and smart farming, which at least are already real physical objects out in the real world, right? But like, what was your experience now selling a product which needs some years until you actually can really deliver it? What was your experience in the industry now?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. So my baseline was a little bit different because I was involved in already doing business development for frontier tech companies. So I was very familiar with how much education you need to conduct with the customer in the market. And this might be an unpopular opinion, but ultimately, I don't think it's as different and daunting and as esoteric as it might seem on the outside. And you really have to love the technology, and you have to love helping and educating the customer if you want to succeed at 0 to 1 sales for a deep tech company. You have to be committed to the subject for a long period of time. There are some differences. So, the gestation period between the customer education and converting an actual contract can sometimes take years, because it takes years to build this kind of hardware and really put it in space. But if you manage to develop the muscle to be able to get into the engineering realities from day one, and you're willing to learn and discover along with the customer, your conviction can pretty much carry you through the rest of the sales process.
Yeah, I will have some follow-up questions to this, but I think I'm gonna bring them later. But Danny, I think you had a follow-up question.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Just regarding the starting in this new industry, right? People always think, oh, space tech, that's you never worked in this field. So was the onboarding on all the space tech and remote sensing hard for you? And how did you do it actually? How did you get into the topic?
Yeah, so I had already gotten into the remote sensing topic pretty deeply through my work in agriculture, especially with the project with Heineken that I described. So I was pretty familiar with the concepts, and I think I was employee number 27 at Pixxel. So we really didn't have a mature onboarding process, right? You really have to figure it all out yourself. And I love talking to the engineers in the company. So it really was a series of pretty unorganized, deep discussions to be able to learn it to the deck, to be able to figure out how to explain it to the customer, then understanding what the customer problem and the pain point was, and then relaying it back to the tech. And you just learn iteratively. For me in particular, I always learn the best interactively. So I learn a lot by just talking to people. So it was pretty unstructured, but sometimes having that unstructured onboarding into the technology is almost the best, because it immediately filters out the right information that you need. And it helps you build an appreciation for the technology such that you are immediately translating it to a customer that probably doesn't understand either. So I think it was just pretty iterative.
And what do you say was the biggest surprise?
The biggest surprise in the space industry was, I'd say, the industry culture, actually. It's the highest concentration of people that are smart, interesting, and nice. Because there you have the industry's X factor, and obviously the impact that space tech can have on the planet is pretty self-evident. My theory is that it automatically just filters out the crowd that's driven by just money. You have to care about the subject for a long time if you want to make it here. And almost everybody that I meet in the sector, they do have a slightly greater purpose, whether they know it or not. And they identify themselves as part of the community first, and then the companies that they work for second. So it's ultimately way more collaborative and friendly than any other sector, which, sometimes it's not as a cutthroat bloodbath as I've seen in other sectors. The other surprise was that it actually makes for a pretty unique global citizenship. It's an international game from day one. And I heard someone at a conference say that it's like Hotel California, where you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave, which sort of explains why people that have been in the sector have been here for decades, solving the hardest problems and still loving every minute of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, what we always see is also you said, all the smart people and a lot of collaboration in the industry. I was also in automotive, where you see a lot of elbow culture, right, and super competitiveness, because there is not a lot of differentiation. And what I found always interesting talking to with Sven to hundreds of investors is, as soon as a company has some satellite images on the website, they think it's competition, right? But it's like comparing every e-commerce shop with each other, which is, it's an entire ecosystem. That's why also Pixxel and LiveView are not a competition, right? So I think it's really interesting. But that's maybe a good point to actually understand what Pixxel is doing, because you're not just another satellite constellation. You're doing some really exciting stuff. So we are curious to hear about the company and your products. So how would you pitch Pixxel?
Yeah, definitely. So Pixxel is building and launching a constellation of 5-meter hyperspectral Earth imaging satellites. And it's a first mover in bringing commercial hyperspectral capacity from space. Hyperspectral allows you to capture information in hundreds of different wavelengths and see things that are otherwise invisible to multispectral satellites, right? So these could be biophysical and biochemical parameters in vegetation, water quality indicators, greenhouse gases, mineral deposit traces, soil chemistry, and so on. So it really goes beyond the visible light. And we started in 2019, and the mission philosophy was inspired by the fact that there were several single facet constellations out there, right? So some really had very, very high revisit, some had very high spatial resolution, but none of them really had the spectral fidelity that was needed to track and monitor the changes on indicators that actually mattered, right? You always had to heavily rely on drones and ground truth and airborne sensors, and you still do in many ways. But I think hyperspectral alleviates that and sort of bridges that gap fairly nicely. So Pixxel set out to build a hyperspectral constellation that could provide customers information in hundreds of bands at the 5-meter resolution and a daily revisit. And in addition to this, we also realized that while this data set would plug a pretty big gap in terms of pure capacity and detail availability, the remote sensing community hasn't worked with hyperspectral a whole bunch because it just simply hasn't been widely available. So in addition to the data, we're also offering what we call an Earth Observation Studio. And it's where scientists and developers can intuitively apply hyperspectral. They can combine it with other data sets and ultimately generate the sharpest and the most specific insight towards their problem. We're not a last mile analytics company. We made a conscious choice just to stay away from that. So the platform is really a developer's toolkit that can catalyze insight generation from remote sensing data sets, hyperspectral being the main one.
Yeah, I think that's...
So we've launched...
Sorry, I just wanted to say it's a very smart move, but please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, we've launched 3 Pathfinder satellites in space and have a pretty decent volume of demo data, which we're circulating with early customers. So we have about 50 early adopters in the commercial world and government world. And also we have many resellers. They have the right community to give us the feedback that's required. And I think it was really important that we did that early on because we're about to launch our flagship fleet of the 5-meter hyperspectral satellites. 6 of them go up between July and October this year. And a lot of the learnings from there have been incorporated into the data set. So it almost feels like we've built the core technology in conjunction with customers and making sure that there was a voice of the end customer and not just sort of a well-defined internal thesis.
Yeah. So you've mentioned obviously the term hyperspectral quite a few times during the last couple of sentences. But what's so special about hyperspectral? I mean, where's the differentiation between hyperspectral and multispectral for the listeners out there? And how and why is hyperspectral important to change the industries here on our Earth?
Yeah, so the human eye can see color of visible light in 3 bands. So that's RGB, red, green, and blue. And the spectral imaging can actually split the spectrum into hundreds of different bands when it comes to hyperspectral. So multispectral, for example, has a few infrared bands, but with hyperspectral, you have hundreds of different wavelengths that are quite narrowly spaced. So when you have this information in hundreds of different wavelengths, it gives you those many more indicators, right? Object, materials, chemical changes, and conditions that you can now monitor and track. And you can start detecting things like crop stress way earlier than it becomes visible in the form of discoloration or deformation, which is really when the multispectral satellites are able to pick it up. And by then, it's almost too late to be able to mitigate the damage or solve the problem, right? So being able to get a symptomatic view of how things are changing early before they show up in what's in the visible light is really the advantage with hyperspectral. And then you can sort of take it forward by starting to classify species and subspecies based on very small differences. And you can have these narrowband indices that track minor changes in pigmentation on a daily level to know if there's threat of invasive species, for example. You can see methane leaks across a pipeline and get a much more clear picture on air and water quality because it can pick up greenhouse gases. So the technology itself can provide you that much more information. And hyperspectral isn't new, right? So that concept has been in sort of labs. It's been available in the form of airborne or handheld sensor instruments. The innovation here is really making it available at scale from space so that it can be widely applied. And that level of detail should almost become the new normal, right? In the way that people analyze phenomena from space.
Why wasn't it done before on the commercial scale? Like, I see a lot of hyperspectral companies right now. What would you say?
Yeah, well, there's a few factors and tailwinds, right, that contributed to it. So there have been a few research missions that have been launched, right, in the past, such as Hyperion and there's Avarice. But I think there was sort of many prohibitive factors from a cost standpoint as well. You have now a lot of innovation in nanotechnology and semiconductors that actually makes it possible to develop satellites in a way that the data set then isn't cost prohibitive for the end customer. So the ability to be able to develop a hyperspectral payload in a form factor that's the size of a mini fridge, which is, the Pixxel satellites that are, anywhere between 50 kgs and 150 kgs, whereas the others are, in the many hundreds of thousands of kilograms. That data set is really complex. It's expensive to be able to maintain and downlink, and ultimately it just becomes really prohibitive to build a business out of it. So those are the factors that really now make it viable, and that's what we've really applied into the design philosophy as well.
Yeah. So I assume that's also very very challenging approach, right? What you're doing. I don't know the exact size, 100 or 200 kilogram or something like this, but you have all these challenges on the hardware side, but also on the data infrastructure side, right? And however, I remember in the very early years when people talked about Pixxel, and also Pixxel was presenting itself, that you also said you want to go the last mile end to end. You just said a few minutes ago that you actually changed your mind. And can you maybe give us an example or maybe some reasons why you changed your mind to not go the last mile? Because we also have a lot of discussions with people around this, and maybe it's great to hear it from you.
Yeah, I think it's a constant evolution, right? There's always this tension where you're so tempted to almost fall into the trap of sort of becoming a last mile analytics companies. Bear in mind, there's entire companies with hundreds of scientists that have been dedicated to doing last mile analytics and solving that problem. And when you end up sort of doing both, you're trying to build two businesses at the same time, and it can defocus you pretty quickly. So we found sort of the right middle ground now, where we have our EO Studio, which is the developer's toolkit that makes it super intuitive and user friendly to be able to extract this insight. And we've sharpened our focus and sort of narrowed that aperture of possibilities on building analytics products where hyperspectral is absolutely needed, and it's the hero data set, right? Because in a scenario like that, even the analytics companies don't really know how to build products for hyperspectral data. Some do, but a majority don't. So in a scenario like that, we basically just pick one or two sort of very pertinent, widespread pain points, which only hyperspectral can solve. And those are the products that we pick and choose to build. So I think it's sort of the right middle ground. And actually, we're glad that we evolved that way, because the other path, obviously is extremely expensive. It's riddled with challenges. The possibility to fail when you already have a whole constellation to put up there with pretty complex technology can get pretty daunting. So I think we've reached this nice middle ground now.
Yeah, I think, as mentioned earlier, I think this is a really wise choice, especially with a difficult data set as hyperspectral is, right? We've seen how difficult it is, and it was for many SAR companies to build up a big user group, because not a lot of people know how to use SAR data, right? And so I think this education or enablement of your end users is super smart. But so to conclude, LiveView is not a competitor, but a potential customer of your data, correct?
Oh, completely. In fact, we really want to peg ourselves with the growth of the analytics industry, right? So as sort of that sector grows, it's a natural complement, right, to plug in hyperspectral into that cocktail of data sets that's really required to combine and come together to provide what the customer actually wants. For us, we're very honest when hyperspectral isn't the one, right? We don't want to force fit it every single time and pretend that it can solve every problem. There are some very, very clear use cases, for example, that synthetic aperture radar is much better suited for. And in a case like that, hyperspectral can be a great complementary data set to be able to creates certain pockets of very, very high resolution with the spectral fidelity as well. So it really is about combining the best data sets in the right volumes that are right for the customer. So we definitely see this as a very complementary sector.
Yeah. And you've mentioned that you already launched 3 Pathfinder missions, right? Maybe first question is, you're the Chief Commercial Officer of Pixxel. How do you sell data ahead of having a full constellation in orbit?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think there's no other way, right? The private sector it's agile and innovative and it can move very fast, but it doesn't have access to unlimited funding and staying power. So and furthermore, the customer education is a very compulsory part of the process, and that takes time. So the best companies are the ones that can actually identify the right early adopters, and the early adopters have they're pretty much of the same DNA as you, right? They are interested in innovation projects. They don't mind failing fast and failing upwards pretty quickly. They're really focused on the upside. So with Pixxel, we found the early adopters, and very often they also found us and reached out to us saying that, we want to learn more about your specifications. We want to take a look at the demo data from the Pathfinders. And counterintuitively, the customers were actually interested, even if it was just demo data that was not at full capacity, because they wanted to start their internal R&D to build that competitive edge with Hyperspectral when it becomes widely available and when there's many other constellations and it becomes mainstream. So it almost worked both ways, and you have to sort of iteratively build with the early adopters, which is really the first trust circle that's able to give you the right feedback before putting up the rest of the constellation.
Nice. And we've mentioned the rest of the constellation. When will you have the rest of the constellation up and running? What's the plan?
Yeah, so we actually this year we launch the flagship fleet of 6 5-meter hyperspectral satellites in October.
Wow.
That's when we'd have coverage and we'd have the ability to really global access. So we won't be able to image every place every day, but we'd be able to image any place every day. And then we're going to back it up with another 18 to 24 satellites by 2026.
So an exciting year for Pixxel for sure.
Yeah, definitely. This is the year where it all happens.
Nice. So it's super cool. So one thing I talked about a lot in the past months with stakeholders from the ecosystem, also investors, was my Investor's Guide to Earth Observation. And in there, I laid down the first wave was in new players in the optical domain. The second one were companies like Capella and ISI in the radar wave. In methane monitoring, we could see a lot of struggles in the past years with companies only focusing on that. Seems to be hard. And now there's thermal and hyperspectral as potential next wave of waves of Earth observation. And I'm happy that you already clarified that you really focus on the hardware and the platform to distribute and not go the last mile. But I'm curious, like how you actually are internally set up. Like how large is your vertical integration? Like, do you have mainly hardware engineers or mainly software engineers? How is the distribution? Because I think really the specialization will lead to success, and we see it with Planet actually reducing their offerings, etc., reducing their sales seems to make it more efficient. Capella already learned from Planet, so I think you actually can learn a lot from Capella already, right? In the third big constellation wave. So yeah, I would be curious how you are set up.
Yeah, so the greatest concentration is the hardware engineers. We have our own clean room facility in Bangalore where we manufacture, design, and build out our satellite buses. The software engineering talent is really focused on building the Earth Observation Studio, which is the developer's toolkit, which actually is an enabler, right? It helps us own the experience with our own data, and it helps customers intuitively derive insights and really drops the technical barrier of entry when it comes to utilizing hyperspectral data. So the greatest concentration is definitely on the hardware side, and we want to stay focused on that and actually get the constellation up, prove out the value of the data set before going into picking which flagship analytics products that we develop. And it's interesting you mentioned some of our contemporaries, and you also mentioned thermal and hyperspectral being the next wave. And the interesting thing about being a first mover is that there's really no precedent, right? You really have to have your ear very close to the ground and listen to customers pretty intently to figure out what they need. So there are going to be a few vertical applications that we build ourselves from our own data set. But again, it's literally going to be very widespread pertinent problems that only we know how to solve, where hyperspectral is super sticky and is really the hero and the primary data set. So definitely set up and skewed towards the hardware engineering side at the moment.
Yeah, I think that is a super smart move, and I mean the commercial Earth observation industry really had to learn a lot in the past years.
You get out in the last 3 seconds.
Okay, sorry. So I think it's a really smart approach, and you could already benefit from all these learnings. How big is your team these days?
So Pixxel is about 170 people, and that changes every week, and spread between about 5 or 6 countries at the moment. We're headquartered in LA in the US, and we have a wholly owned subsidiary in India, which is where we do a lot of our manufacturing.
Yeah, exciting. One thing we could also see in the industry is, for example, Capella. They had an API up and running and simulated data sets before they had the satellites in orbit, right? Do you also approach it in the same way, like actually having services already which you can sell, which would help you specifically in your position before you had the satellites up?
So yes and no. We definitely have a comprehensive set of API keys that will be available to be able to ingest the data. But we took a slightly different approach to provide customers with a similar experience, right? So we did hyperspectral drone pilots with certain customers so that we could communicate the power of having hundreds of different bands. Obviously, with the understanding that this has to be upsampled from a spatial resolution standpoint. We've also done simulations from our demo data to what a 5-meter data set would actually look like. And we've shared that with customers. And then finally, our own pathfinders have actually proven to be pretty interesting data pilots where we task with whatever limited capacity we have, specific customer prescribed areas of interest. And that's really when they have some experience with the bands, and we do white glove support for these customers to help them define what is the right combination of bands, what's the right default band set that they ultimately need to solve their problem. Because there's also a lot of information with hyperspectral, right? So you have to be pretty frugal with regards to how you can use the additionality without getting overwhelmed by too much unnecessary information. So those are the kinds of projects that we did with our customers. So it was a combination of drone pilots, 5-meter simulations, and then also data from our own tech demos.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Coming to the end of the podcast, we would ask some questions around the ecosystem. In the recent past, we see a lot of activity on the commercial side coming out of India. A lot of startups being active in one of the leading aerospace centers around the world. So how do you see the market development in India?
Oh, I think it's extremely positive. The sector has recently been privatized, and that's really where you're seeing some of the best innovations come out. The government is extremely supportive for it. The government also wants to be able to encourage more companies to be able to build indigenous products, indigenous satellites, right? So overall, it's a very, very supportive ecosystem. And I'd say there's at least about 15 to 20 private space tech companies that have come up in India, that have sprung up in India over the last 3 to 4 years.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so much aerospace engineering talent in India, which has flight heritage, right? This is also, I think, like something great to tap into. But I mean, there are some other companies out there which do something similar, right, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, companies like Wyvern or Kuva Space, right? And even Planet, right, which is also having a hyperspectral offering right now. And now we see a lot of players which actually offer satellite as a service. But to my understanding, you're building the bus in-house, and you were not going to a satellite as a service company for the bus. What was the reasoning for that?
So the reason we didn't go for the satellite as a service model, and we didn't want to go for an off-the-rack solution was because we wanted to build something proprietary, right? We wanted to make hyperspectral data available that was science grade, but yet had commercial capacity and affordability. So it really involved thinking of the camera concept from scratch. And as a result, we wanted to own the design, the integration, and the manufacturing of the satellite. Of course, we have a global supply chain for parts, but it's predominantly done in-house because the tech itself is proprietary.
Yeah. Now wrapping up the podcast, I would feel bad if I wouldn't ask this question before ending. On your website, you have stated a very big vision which goes beyond Earth. Can you say something about that vision?
Yeah, so the vision is definitely to be able to utilize the infrastructure of a viable space company to be able to do far more exciting projects in space. With hyperspectral, you ultimately gain the power of scanning surfaces, right, for hundreds of different indicators and materials, and that opens up early stage possibilities for looking at things like asteroid mining, to be able to go deeper into the orbit, to be able to bring more and more modalities as well. So there's many different directions, and the focus at the moment is obviously to prove this out as a viable data set, with customers, and ultimately start doing some of the more cool esoteric space data stuff.
Nice. That's really exciting. Yeah. And now, like maybe the last question about more like the future. If you let's say go 10 years from now, 15 years from now, what do you think is the potential how like to improve life on Earth with through hyperspectral data, and like where do you see your impact you're generating?
Yeah, I definitely look at hyperspectral becoming the new normal in the next 10 years. It's almost like the evolution of of the smartphone cameras, right? Where you can now take literally studio quality photographs, and that level of detail being available from space, as a new normal, as sort of the new baseline, is what's really necessary, right? So we end up sort of creating very, very expensive islands of high density information through drones and airborne sensors, and in situ sensors, and that doesn't scale because it's very cumbersome and it's also expensive. So being able to reduce the dependency on that and having this high level of granularity from space, where you are able to track hundreds of different indicators and you're able to do it with reliability at a frequency that actually matters, to be able to get sort of a daily view on how these small changes take place, that can open up a whole bunch of possibilities on the carbon sequestration side, where you can look at above ground biomass, on the greenhouse gas monitoring side, on a whole bunch of different environmental parameters. So I definitely see hyperspectral sort of becoming the new normal in the next 10 years.
That's a strong statement. It's the new normal in the coming decades, and I can confirm this. Like we really looking forward at LiveView to use hyperspectral data in the future. I mean, the daily revisit, etc. This is super exciting, and I totally second what you said, that it's going to have a crazy big impact on the industry. So yeah, really exciting podcast. I would love to talk longer with you. At the end of the podcast, we already thinking about the next podcast, and we always ask our guests if you have a company or a person we should talk to.
I think you should talk to the people at Albedo. They're a peer constellation, and very often we feel like kindred spirits because we're going through the same motions at the same time. And they're doing something pretty disruptive. So I would recommend talking to Albedo.
Yeah, that's a great one. We were in touch with Albedo already since it was only the founders. Really exciting company. So yeah, let's get in touch with Albedo for one of the next podcasts. So Aakash, really thanks a lot for the exciting podcast. We really appreciate this. I think the listeners are also excited to use your data. And yeah, make sure for our listeners to connect with Aakash and Pixxel, follow Pixxel on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, wherever you are on. And Aakash, I wish you a great journey this year. I hope we can record another one when Pixxel has the constellation up and running. So thanks a lot. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, very much looking forward to it. And thanks again for creating this kind of platform. Really appreciate it, Sven and Daniel.